All right, welcome everyone. Good evening and welcome to the distinguished lecture series here at the Field Institute for Research in Mathematical Science. We're not at the Field Institute, for those who are not familiar, it's at College and St. George, but we're very lucky to have this space here for this lecture. I don't think fields could accommodate the audience we have here. So I'll just say a few words. I'm the Deputy Director of the Field Institute. Director Deirdre Haskell is here as well tonight. And for those who are not familiar with the Institute, I'll just say a few words about it. So the Field Institute is a center for mathematical innovation and collaboration, not just in Canada, but internationally. It was founded with the mission to provide a supportive and stimulating environment for innovation and education in mathematics and related fields. And so we basically bring together mathematicians from Canada and abroad, from academia, business, industry, to work together and to sort of formulate questions, investigate problems of mutual interest. Founded by who? So we were founded by 9 principal sponsoring universities here in Ontario. We also have a broader network of affiliate universities that is global. I mentioned the affiliate universities for 2 reasons. One, because one of our newest affiliate universities, University College London, from which today's speaker is joining us. And also, if your university is not an affiliate university, maybe there would be some interest in that at the Field's website if you're more sort of mathematically adjacent and are interested in your university joining as an affiliate institution of the. So the Institute's Distinguished Lecture Series brings leading international scientists to the field or to a conveniently located larger venue to deliver a sequence of lectures that bridge fundamental theory with cutting-edge applications. Through these lectures, the Field Institute continues to promote mathematical activity across Canada and internationally, and helps expand the application of mathematics in modern society, touching on fields ranging from theoretical cosmology to medical imaging to financial. What makes tonight's lecture particularly special is that intersection that it represents, where mathematics meets neuroscience and where statistical theory illuminates the workings of the human mind. I'm very excited about tonight's lecture, and to introduce our speaker, I'm going to hand the microphone over to the organizer, John Griffiths.
Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on a lovely sunny evening. So I'm going to say a few brief words to set the scene for the event and also for Karl, and then hand over to Karl. So as probably people know, because probably everyone saw the registration information, there's a series of 3 lectures coming up, and we're at lecture 1, and that's indicated by the big orange box there. Now, what's the context here? So I want to say first some thanks to the institutions and individuals who've contributed to making this event happen. The institutions, we had funding contributions from SICKID, NSERC, and a lot of person power from individuals at MH, which is where I'm based, UT, and of course SICKID. So big thanks from me to the organizing committee, the BrainMode organizing committee, which have also been this lecture series organizing committee, and also the folks at Fields who've done a lot of the heavy lifting as well. Now, we're coming to you from, as I mentioned, these 2 places. So Patrick mentioned the Fields Institute. I don't have a laser pointer, so I'll point my finger. There's the Fields Institute. There's a picture there. Actually, the architecture is amazing inside. If you have the chance to visit, there's a very stylishly designed staircase atrium, and basically a stone's throw away, like 25 meters away, if you follow my finger along, is a Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And if you go right up to the top floor of that slightly ugly building, that's where the Criminal Center for Neuroinformatics is. And a lot of the organizational work and people who brought this to you today are based there. So a little shout out for us at KCNI, and we're very happy to be here. That final image there, by the way, is the view from the window. So we have a pretty great view from the 12th floor of KMH. Now, the context for the Karl's lecture series today is actually a larger series of events that are running for the rest of the year and have been running since the summer. So this is one of the feature programming that the Fields Institute do is they run these things called thematic programs. And you can go to the website and look back through the history of what there's a great resource of interesting content, some of which has been in neuroscience before. But the key thing is this year, we've been running the Fields Institute thematic program on mathematical neuroscience. And thanks and props here go to Maya Fraser in particular, who's been leading the organizational team and really brought this into existence. There's lots of content here. So if you're interested in more of kind of what you're hearing today, but also things that are quite different to what you're hearing today, there's courses, there's more events and workshops, there's lots of opportunity to get involved in mathematical neuroscience. But thanks to Fields for making that happen. And the Distinguished Lecture Series is sort of the feature event of this year's program. So there's some of the stuff that's going on, and that's not even all of it. But check out the website if you're interested in learning more about that. Now, I'm going to move on to Introduction to Karl, and I was instructed that I can't say too much, but there's a few important things to get in. So Professor Karl Friston, University College London, has been a innovator and a seminal figure in a number of scientific fields that I've been working in and paying attention to at the time that I've been a research scientist. The methodology of brain imaging, statistical and computational methodology of how we understand what to do with measurements we make of people in an MRI scanner doing tasks, also with other types of measurements that we can make. So broadly speaking, how we analyze brain imaging data is one of the areas that Karl's made as much of a contribution as anyone you could name over the last, say, 30 years. Another area, both of these aren't actually the main focus of the lecture series. Another area is moving into, say, systems and computational neuroscience is how we think about the brain as a network system, networked dynamical system. So brain connectivity, concepts of brain connectivity, statistical methodologies for analyzing data in order to learn about connectivity. This is another area that Karl's made seminal contributions to, again, as much as anyone else you can name in the field. And then the third area, which is really the focus of the lecture series here, although I'm sure there'll be elements of both those things in all three lectures, is broadly speaking, say, Bayesian brain theory. This is or predictive processing, predictive coding. So this is more sort of at the interface between neuroscience, psychology, artificial intelligence, or machine learning, and also clinical neuroscience as well. So it's an interesting intersection. And I told Karl a little anecdote just actually 10 minutes ago, and he said, "John, you have to say that." So I'll just relay it. So this line of work that Karl's been contributing to, that I think it's been the main focus of his work for the last decade or so, has the first articulation of the ideas that, broadly speaking, is the free energy principle that you'll be hearing a lot about over the next three days. Was a paper that I'm not sure if it's widely read, but it's called A Theory of Cortical Responses. I think it was published in 2005. And I have a very specific memory of this paper, which is I was an undergraduate, just finished my undergraduate degree. I was just in this sort of hazy period where you've had all your exams and you haven't left the campus yet, and it's all sort of wonderful and hazy. And one of the things that I did in this time was I went to the library and just printed out a load of things that I was interested in reading, that I'd come across over the previous year, really had seemed sort of important, but hadn't really had the chance to really sink my teeth into. And it was all over the place. There was a lot of cognitive neuroscience, some stuff on consciousness, some stuff on brain connectivity that was probably also from Karl. And then there was this paper called A Theory of Cortical Responses, which is airing this idea that seemed sort of mind-blowing to me at the time, and I think maybe feels that way to a lot of people as well, that we can use tools that essentially have been developed as statistical tools, mathematical statistical tools for doing algorithms to think and understand what the brain's doing in the context of certain kinds of cognitive processing. So that's broadly speaking the free energy principle, and that was aired probably like 2 months before I actually found this paper and printed it out. And the story is that I printed out this stack of papers, and I just took off for the day. I walked into the woods with my reading and I guess some food and some water, because I was out for a while, and just got stuck in. And that was one of the pieces of new ideas that really sunk into my head at that point. Special moment. Intellectual freedom to be able to discover it at an early point. So without further ado, I'll go on to introducing Karl and let you take over the mic. Are you plugged in, Karl?
I am plugged in.
Yeah, so I think that's enough introduction. Introducing Karl Friston.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And also thank you for inviting me. It's a great privilege and honor to participate in this lecture series. I should also say it's been a privilege and honor to witness the first day of brain modes at the Fields Institute. And so my head is spinning with mathematical ideas and equations, and I've almost forgotten my own story, but it will come back when we start going through the slides. And I also have a little bit of imposter syndrome, because I don't have any formal training in mathematics, and yet here I am meant to entertain with maths. I remind myself I did do quantum physics and probability theory at Cambridge, but then I forgot everything, apart from the endearing arrogance of the physicist. So I am going to show some equations, but I reassure people in the audience who are not mathematically literate that all of this is basically Wikipedia. So all the work that I've done since 2005 has come from Wikipedia. I'm also told that you need to hear this lecture 3 times before the simplicity of it sinks in. So it's very fortuitous. I'm going to give the lecture 3 times. I'm going to use different words, or 3 different words, but it's the same story, just told from different perspectives. The perspective we're going to start with sometimes is described as a sort of the high road to the free energy principle, which is the physics backstory, the story that would license a formal description of self-organization, particularly self-organization of our behavior. Sort of physics of sense-making and decision-making. You could be described as a physics of sentience. Tomorrow, it's going to be more like the low road. It's a kind of lecture that I give to cognitive neuroscientists or doctors who wanted to understand how we work, indeed how we don't work at times. Inheriting ideas from probably Plato, but certainly Kant and Helmholtz, and we'll pursue that tomorrow from a sort of more machine learning, cognitive science perspective. And then the last lecture, again, it's the same story, but is celebrating some of the great thinkers behind these stories, but also focusing on what makes us special, what makes us good scientists, good mathematicians, good doctors, how we reason, how we understand and make sense of our world. And indeed, solicit the right kind of evidence and ask the right kinds of questions to make sense of that world. So today is going to be the high road, and I'm going to actually let my erstwhile colleague Jeff Hinton and current Toronto citizen do the heavy lifting, just in terms of introducing the key idea. Now, this is quite quiet, but I've also transcribed what is his response to a question at the end, the very last question at his receipt of the UCDC's medal. He was asked, if you could go back in time, who would you like to meet? And this was his response.
I would like to meet Helmholtz. And I'd like to meet Helmholtz believed in unconscious perceptual inference. He basically thought that when you're doing vision, you're doing lots of inference, but it's not kind of conscious, deliberate inference. You're inferring from the proximal stimulus, you're inferring what the state of the world is that gave rise to that. And he was clearly right about that. So that was one branch of Helmholtz's work. A different branch of Helmholtz's work was free energy. There's something called Helmholtz free energy. And what Helmholtz didn't realize was that if you're trying to do inference in a complicated model with complicated latent variables, a statistician would tell you to do inference by, given the current parameters of your model, take the data and figure out the best way for your model to explain the data. And there might be several ways for your model to explain the data, but you have to figure out the probability of each of those ways in which your model could explain the data in order to adjust the parameters of your model. And what variational inference says is, actually, you don't have to get that probability right. You can approximate that probability and still guarantee you'll learn a better model, or rather there's some bound that'll improve. And so the two completely different bits of Helmholtz's career, the work on free energy and the work on perceptual inference, were actually very closely related. And free energy is the key to being able to do perceptual inference tractably. And I'd love to tell Helmholtz that.
I would like to meet Helmholtz.
I would like to meet Helmholtz.
And I'd like to meet Helmholtz.
So that's my lecture, basically. So if you didn't quite hear it or understand Jeff's very concise and erudite summary, my job is to really unpack that story for you. And I repeat, unpack it from several different perspectives. So this talk is going to be about the physics of self-organization, how, with some special attention to how we define the things that are self-organizing, the nature of in self-organization, we can derive a Bayesian mechanics that speaks to this notion of inference and sense-making, and how that can be described as a free energy minimizing process. So we're going to talk about the statistics of life with a special focus on Markov blankets and Bayesian mechanics that inherit from the very existence of these blankets. We're then going to move to exactly the same narrative, but articulated as a neurobiologist or neuroscientist might understand it, in terms of predictive coding and how predictive coding and the requisite message passing or processes unfold on neuronal networks, which are very similar to neural networks in machine learning. And then, should we have time, and I do tend to talk a lot, John, so tell me when we've got that 10 minutes before we want to move to the Q&A. I want to just take it beyond just sense-making and decision-making, just ask, what does this kind of physics tell us about the difference between things that have authentic agency, that are agents and act in a way that can be understood in terms of selfhood and the kind of decision-making that you and I enjoy, as opposed to, say, being a virus or a thermostat. So let's start. We're going to start with a question posed by Schrödinger. How can the events in space and time which take place within the spatial boundary of a living organism be accounted for by physics and chemistry? Now, we're not going to answer that question, but we are going to pick up on something quite key here, which is the notion of a boundary. And just note that in the absence of any way of demarcating, individuating, or separating something, say a cell, from everything else, or no thing, or nothing, you have to be able to define a boundary. And I'm going to take as a boundary a statistical definition of a boundary, as Schrödinger would, I think, be the first to acknowledge, was the right thing to do. And I'm going to use the notion of a Markov blanket as a statistical boundary. So for those of you who don't know, let's just see, who knows what a Markov boundary is? Right, you. Can you tell your friends what a Markov blanket is? Oh, you want to make him do it? I won't embarrass you because you don't have a mic. What he would have said, what Dimitri would have said, and his colleague, is a Markov boundary. A Markov boundary is a special case of a Markov blanket, minimal Markov blanket. It's best understood in terms of some universe. So I've cartooned a universe here in terms of some arbitrary states denoted by the circles, and these states influence in a causal sense, in a cause-effect sense, other states, and those influences are denoted by these little edges or arrows here. And if I were to pick some set of states, say my internal states, then the Markov blanket constitutes or is constituted by the parents, the children, and the parents of the children of the internal states. And that set of states, this partition into internal states and the external states and the blanket states enables me to separate the internal states from the external states in cyan here. What do I mean by separate? Well, what I mean is if I wanted to know how my internal states were going to evolve over time, given the rest of the universe, I would only need to know my blanket states. All the information in the entire universe necessary to predict me or describe my internal states is contained within the blanket states. So technically, we're saying that the probability of my internal states is conditionally independent of the external states given, conditioned upon the blanket states. I'm going to make a further move here. I'm going to separate or partition the blanket states into active states and sensory states. And that partitioning is very simple. It just means that the sensory states influence but are not influenced by the internal states, and the active states are influenced but do not influence the internal states. And you may be asking, why am I doing that? Well, I'll try and make that clear on the next slide. But just to emphasize, what we've done here is just introduced a partition based upon the cause-effect structure or the dynamical influences or causal influences among some arbitrary states in some universe. And with that partition, I can now talk about the blanket states around my internal states, and they define a kind of particle, and I'm going to refer to those as particular states and states of a particle. So what kind of particles are we interested in? So here's my favorite particle, the brain, possibly me or you. So here we can conceive of the brain states, the internal states, as all the states of a brain I would need to enumerate and quantify to tell you what the state of the brain was at the moment. Synaptic efficacy, synaptic firing rates, synaptic connection strengths, and any other attendant state of my brain. And then those internal states influence my active states. Those could be my actuators, my autonomic reflexes, my actuators being my muscles, so I can move around and change the state of the external world. And the external states in turn then cause changes in the sensory states, my sensory epithelia, my sensory receptors, and my sense organs that then influence my internal states, but are not influenced by my internal states, and so completing the cycle. So we've basically got, from a systems theoretic perspective, just a specification of the inputs and outputs as something that can be individuated from everything else. We've also induced a circular causality, very much akin to the action perception cycle. So the inside does influence the outside, but vicariously over the Markov blanket via the active sector, while the outside influences the inside, again vicariously through the sensory sector of this Markov blanket. So what I want you to do now is temporarily forget about the Markov blanket. What we're going to do is a crash course in physics, and then put the Markov blanket back into play and see what special kind of mechanics emerge. And I should say there's nothing like special about this in the sense that it rests on exactly the same maths that you'd find in statistical mechanics, quantum mechanics, and indeed classical mechanics. I'm going to start with assuming the existence of some universe that can be described in terms of a random dynamical system, say, for example, an Orangevin equation, where the rate of change of some states of the world can be expressed in terms of some slow flows that are lawful functions of where I am in state space, plus some random fluctuations of some sort. And I'm just cartooning that here in terms of two states. And this can be, as I say, any scale and any level of abstraction. So, for example, it could be the voltage and conductance of a dendritic process in a cell in my brain, or it could be a description of the cardiac cycle as it goes through its beats, or it could be me getting up in the morning, doing my emails, having a cup of coffee, having lunch. It could be over a much more extended timescale. It could be describing some kind of replication at an evolutionary timescale. The key point being that these states follow this trajectory over time and always revisit states that they were once in. So what we're saying is we're looking at a particular kind of dynamics that features a recurrence of states that are characteristic of the thing in question or the system in question. Technically, we're talking about a pullback attractor. You could describe this alternatively, or think about this alternatively in terms of the probability or the density of these trajectories on which there are random fluctuations as scoring the probability that you'd find B in this state if sampled at a random point in time. And that would lend this interpretation or an interpretation of this pullback attractor in terms of the non-equilibrium steady state distribution. So we can also interpret this as a probability density of the kind of states that are characteristic of me, the states that that characterize the kind of thing that I am and the kind of thing that I not am. It would be very surprising to find me in these states, in the states that are not part of this attracting set. That's a useful interpretation, simply because we know an enormous amount about the density dynamics that attend these kinds of structures. And most of you will be familiar with these in one form or another, either master equations, Schrödinger equations. I've written it down here in terms of a Fokker-Planck equation that simply expresses the rate of change of this probability density over time as a function of the amplitude of the random fluctuations, this is this gamma here, and the flow that determines my trajectory through state space. So why have I done that? Well, we've just said that the kind of things that we are interested in have these characteristic states, they have this pullback attractor, therefore the probability density in and of itself does not change with time, which means that I can now take the solution of these density dynamics, this Fokker-Planck equation, and that allows me now to express my dynamics, my flow, as a function of the amplitude of the random fluctuations and the probability, the log probability you will find me in any particular state when sampled at random, given that I am me. And I've expressed this using something called the Helmholtz, or technically the Helmholtz-Hodge decomposition, where I've expressed this flow in terms of a gradient flow on this log probability that is also equipped with a solenoidal flow or an orthogonal flow, a non-dissipative or conservative flow that is at right angles effectively to the dissipative part. Just to make that a little bit more intuitive, I'm sure you're, for the non-mathematicians, you just think about water flowing out of the bath. You've got the gradient flows as the water flows down potential gradients. But you've also got the circular flow, which is this solenoidal flow. And that's quite important from the point of view of certainly neuroscience, but more generally biotic self-organization, because that solenoidal flow is characteristic of all kinds of things that we like to study, whether we're talking about oscillations in the brain, or indeed alpha oscillations, John, right through to biological motion, through to replication and reproduction, which you could also say is definitive of life, right the way through to very conservative dynamics, such as the motion of the heavenly bodies. This is all the conservative part or non-dissipative part of this flow. But our interest is going to be more on the admixture of this gradient flow and the circular flow. So now let's put the Markov blanket back into this description of the dynamics of things that exist in the sense of possessing a pullback attractor or a solution, a non-equilibrium steady state solution. What about the Markov blanket? Well, that Helmholtz decomposition still applies, and crucially, it applies to all the subsets in that Markov partition, particularly the internal and the active states. And because by construction, the internal and active states are not functions of the external states, we can now write down the dynamics of me in terms of my autonomous states, my internal states, my active states, as a gradient flow on the log probability of my blanket states, here, my sensory states. And we can liken this, or what I'm going to try and compel you to interpret, we can liken this to perception and action. So my internal states will look as if I'm sense-making, and my active states will be realizing my decision-making in terms of acting upon the world and changing the world to produce new sensory states. I just want to license that just by appealing to a number of global brain theories largely, but and beyond, or theories of self-organization generically, that conform to this, this very simple formulation that just comes from the existence of a Markov blanket. So let's just take the simplest interpretation. So it would look as if my autonomous states are trying to increase, moving up these log probability gradients. So how could I interpret that log probability? Well, I've just said the states that constitute or support high probabilities are those states that are characteristic of me. They have value for me. They define the kind of states that I'm in. So we can associate this log probability's potential or negative potential with value. So what this means is that we can think of action and perception as trying to maximize value so defined. And indeed, one can read off this reinforcement learning. If you're an engineer, this would be optimal control theory. And if you're an economist, you can read this in terms of expected utility theory. That's nice because the negative of this log probability in information theory is known as self-information or surprisal, or more simply surprise. It just scores the implausibility of finding me in a particular state. And indeed, the free energy, the variation of free energy that Jeff was talking about, that inherits from the work of Richard Feynman, is a variational bound on this surprise. And this information theoretical interpretation means that we can now talk to people understanding self-organization in terms of things like the Max principle, the principle of maximum mutual information, or principles of minimum redundancy, and indeed the free energy principle itself, given this variational bound on self-information. In turn, that is nice because the average of surprise, or the average of self-information, is entropy, which means that it looks as if internal active states are trying, on average, to minimize entropy. Of course, that's the holy grail of self-organization, indicated Hermann Haeckel's synergetics here. But you could also, if I was a physiologist, just describe this in terms of homeostasis. It's just keeping my certain sensory, essential sensory states, physiological states, within viable bounds, within my attracting set that define me as a physiological entity. There's a fourth interpretation, though, which I'm going to pursue, which a statistician would bring to the table. So she would say, oh, well, this thing here, this probability of these sensory states, these sensory data given me, if I can interpret me as a model of how my sensory states are caused, this is just called a marginal likelihood. It's also called model evidence in Bayesian statistics. And this means that we can interpret perception and action so defined in terms of maximizing moral evidence. In philosophy, some people like to call this self-evidencing, literally acting to seek out evidence for you as a model of your lived world. Can also be understood in terms of the Bayesian brain hypothesis. Technically, from the point of view of information theory, we can look at this as evidence accumulation. One nice example of that, which now dominates in certain parts of neuroscience, is predictive coding, which we'll take a look at later. So, predictive coding and neural networks. Telling the same story, but now using a slightly different rhetoric and a different set of notions. And in fact, one could probably go back to the students of Plato. I'm going to take it back to this early oil painter, famed for painting still lives, that when viewed from a different perspective, give you a very different visual impression. So if previously you saw a bowl of fruit, and now you see a face, then the point he's making here is that you made that face. It's something that you constructed as an explanation for this particular pattern of sensory impressions on the sensory epithelium or the sensory sector of your Markov blanket. So the idea here is that this perception, the internal states, which we're going to focus on until the third part of the talk, the internal states are actually constructing an explanation for and making sense of the sensory impressions that are caused by something out there to which you do not have access. Your brain, if it's the brain in question, is skull-bound. It cannot see through or behind or beyond. It's the Markov blanket, or the sensory part of the Markov blanket. So Andy Clark often, Neil Seth like to describe this as very much an inside-out notion of perception, which contrasts with 20th century views where people used to think that you could extract information in an outside-in kind of way to categorize or classify or recognize things. This turns it on its head and says, no, you are generating hypotheses, fantasies, making the brain literally a fantastic organ that are then put to the test in terms of, can they explain these sensory impressions or not? And if they can't, then we're going to revise, literally, using Bayesian belief updating, our hypotheses, our fantasies, our explanations, until we get a good account of what could have caused our sensory input. So this notion, which you could trace through Kant, to my mind, most beautifully articulated by Helmholtz. So, for example, objects are always imagined as being present in field of vision, as would have to be there in order to produce the same impression on the nervous mechanism. So again, what he's trying to get across is you have to have it on the inside before you can perceive it. It's an explanation for what's going on. Very closely aligned with 20th century ideas from psychology. I picked out here Richard Gregory, the notion that perception is hypothesis testing. To perceive is to look and to test your hypothesis that this is a face or this is a cat. These ideas were used to great effect in machine learning by, in particular, Geoffrey Hinton and Peter Dayan. And they actually built a Helmholtz machine as a sort of mathematical image of a Bayesian brain, borrowing from the Bayesian mechanics that we've just spoken about, and in particular, this variational bound developed by Richard Feynman in the context of the pathological formulation of quantum electrodynamics. But let's just go back to Helmholtz and just think about this notion of impressions on the nervous mechanism. So from our perspective, that's basically impressions on the sensory sector of our Markov blanket, our sensory veil. And I've tried to illustrate this here by picturing some sensory impressions as shadows on some sensory epithelia. And if this interpretation of perception is right, then I am, or at least I can be described as trying to make sense. You know, is that caused by a bird? Is it caused by a leaf? What is the cause of these sensory impressions on my Markov blanket? And how can we understand that in terms of sense making? Well, we already know how to understand that because we know what the underlying physics is. We know what the Bayesian mechanics is because that's simply the Helmholtz decomposition applied to this Markov blanket partition. So I've just written this out again in a way that an engineer would understand it. And in so doing, this related to something called Kalman filtering or Bayesian filtering more generally, and in particular, predictive coding. And the move here is very simple. It's just saying that if I can interpret, I can leverage this conditional independence that inherits from the nature of the Markov blanket to interpret my internal states as playing the role of the parameters of, or the sufficient statistics of some probability distribution about or over the external states, then I've now got a recipe and an interpretation of this Helmholtz decomposition in terms of sense making and Bayesian inference. And notice that for the first time in physics, we can now talk about one set of variables, say the internal states, holding beliefs of a Bayesian sort, in the sense reading Bayesian beliefs as conditional probability distributions, about something else, because we've now got a partition. We've got a difference between internal and external, going beyond, say, an idealized gas and its heat bath, for example. And this particular interpretation, well, I've written it out here. So if I now associate the internal states mu with the parameters of some, what people usually refer to as a variational density or an approximate posterior density over the external states eta here, then I can now just interpret this Helmholtz decomposition in terms of the solenoidal part, the non-dissipative part, in terms of a prediction, and the gradient part, the dissipative part, in terms of an update. So if I knew the state of the world, then I can work out how it's going to change because I know about the flow of the world. And I can use that as a prediction, but then I can update it using the gradients of the free energy. So what would that look like? Well, it turns out these precision-weighted or inverse precision-weighted free energy gradients can be written down very simply as a prediction error. So what's a prediction error? Well, imagine I had this sensory impression on my sensory epithelia, and I had some internal brain state that said, oh, it's likely to be a howling dog. And if I had some generative model that was able to generate what I would see if my expectation mu was correct, then I can take the prediction of what I should be seeing if I was right and subtract it from the actual sensory impression, and the mismatch is just the prediction. And this equation, this Helmholtz, this gradient flow or Helmholtz decomposition, is just tells you it will look as if I'm using my prediction error to change my internal states and therefore update my beliefs or my representations or my fantasies about the cause of my sensations. And of course, if I can predict exactly all my sensory inputs, then job done. I've got a good enough explanation of what's going on. There is no more gradient. I've minimized my free energy, and I've now got a sufficient or a good enough explanation for the causes of my sensations. Notice you'll never know what actually caused the sensations. That doesn't matter. If you can keep your prediction errors small for the rest of your life, job done. That's all you need to do. You never need to know and never will know what's actually out there. So that perspective means that we can put aside all the physics of self-organization and just summarize everything, all these gradient flows or the bits that, the dissipative parts, we can just summarize it in terms of minimizing prediction errors weighted by their inverse variance or their precision, which is really nice because what that means is we can tell ourselves, tell our children, our patients and our colleagues that perception is just changing your mind by changing your internal states so that what you predict is now more like your sensory inputs. But there's another way of minimizing prediction error. You can actually change your sensations by moving and sampling the world. You can palpate the world either by touching or visual palpation by looking around in a way that makes the sensations more like your predictions. And we can associate that with action. So this is not magical. It's very, very simple in the sense that we're not trying to fulfill the predictions of everything, every sensory modality, but those things that we can predict, like the positions of our body, for example, or our stretch receptors that live in our muscles. We can predict those, and our reflexes can make them come true. So what we're effectively talking about is a predictive coding scheme with reflexes. But this is a sort of, right, for the neurobiologists in the audience, here's a sort of cartoon of what this might look like. How could I unpack this Helmholtz decomposition or this gradient flow in a way that can speak to neurophysiology and neuroanatomy? I think the first thing to notice is that all this rests upon, or certainly the interpretation of the gradients of the free energy as prediction errors rests on a generative model that can generate predictions. More generally, the variational density rests upon a generative model, which is just a probabilistic specification of cause and consequence. And this is the external states and their sensory consequences on my Markov blanket. We know then that the generative model has to be good enough to explain any given universe, eco-niche, or lived world. And that world will have certain properties, such as, for example, scale invariance, will have a hierarchical structure. So we know that the inside, the internal architecture of our generative models, entailed by our internal states, must have a similar kind of hierarchical structure. So we're just going to unpack that Helmholtz decomposition in a hierarchical sense. When you do that, you get a description which is remarkably apt for describing neuronal dynamics. So let's just look at an example of that, say, in vision, particularly active vision. So let's say we had some input from the retina, conveying visual image data, and it comes into the lateral geniculate nucleus, a small pair of nuclei in the middle of the brain. And it's in receipt of top-down predictions from the generative model, so the visual cortex at the back of the brain. And through comparison, we elaborate a prediction error, and then that prediction error is just sent forward to update or revise our expectations, encoded in a certain kind of cell type and neural population, to try and vitiate or attenuate or reduce that prediction error. But this process is repeated hierarchically. So now I've got a belief, a first order belief or expectation of a Bayesian sort, subpersonal, encoded by the activity of certain neurons with receptive fields of a particular sort in the visual cortex. And that itself now is in receipt of top-down predictions. So you get these second order prediction errors, and then they're sent up to revise these expectations so that the expectations can now minimize the second order prediction errors, and so on, and to any hierarchical depth that you may require. So the picture that emerges is exactly what we find in the real brain, and actually what you can find in even, say, intracellular dynamics. You have a reciprocal kind of message passing that is ascending, this is prediction errors, and then that are countered by a descending stream of predictions that are trying to eliminate the prediction errors and thereby minimize the free energy gradients and implicitly minimize prediction error or the free energy. What about action? Well, let's think about another kind of sensory input, this time called proprioception, which is coming from the stretch receptors in my muscles that control where I'm actively looking, where I'm palpating the visual scene. Now, this proprioceptive input come in here, sketched in terms of arriving at the nuclei in the pons. It is in receipt of top-down predictions, and there's a prediction error. Now, I could use this prediction error, if I didn't attenuate it, to revise my beliefs about where I'm looking, or what the disposition of the pose of my eye. Or I can take that exact same prediction error and attenuate its effect on my brain, my central nervous system, and redirect it back into the world to act upon the world via the active states, and simply drive my muscles until they are reporting what I predicted. So this is just a description of a classical motor reflex, and also applies to autonomic reflexes. And this gives you a very different picture now of predictive coding. Now, the predictions are now supplying the set points, sometimes called equilibrium points, that reflexes fulfill. And this is very much how we work, certainly in terms of spinal reflexes and the classical knee-jerk reflex. This is exactly how it works. That all the heavy lifting is done by the body and these reflexes, and all you need to do is supply the set points that you think are apt for describing what you should be doing or are going to do next. So, is that a sufficient account of the way that we actively engage with the world? You can certainly get a long way with this Bayesian mechanics and predictive coding like version of or implementation of this Bayesian mechanics. This is one of my favorite examples. What we've done here is just build a synthetic agent and equipped it with a prior belief that something is moving around and it's pulling its finger towards it. Technically, what we did is we created a heterokinetic cycle based on a lawful Volterra system here that had these abstract internal states just pursuing this heterokinetic cycle, this orbit, and then mapped the unstable fixed points of this orbit to some points in some extrapersonal Euclidean space. And then under the generative model that we gave this agent, these points now constitute the centers of an invisible point that is attached by a spring to the agent's finger. So the agent believes that its finger is being pulled around by an invisible point and expects to feel its arm, its fingers being pulled and moving in this direction, and expects to see this happen. So these predictions, proprioceptive predictions, are then fulfilled by action, and in this example, there's a little bit of handwriting, and of course, generates the visual input that it expects to see. So it's authoring its own sensorium. It's causing all the structure in its world that it expects to see, that actually comes ultimately from these autonomous dynamics in the brain that have this sort of solenoidal aspects that we were talking about before. I like this example because it now allows you to sort of play around. And that's, well, what would happen if we simply remove the proprioceptive prediction errors? So it would be as if, but preserve the visual input. So it would be as if the hand was still moving around, writing letters J and A, but you couldn't feel it. So it'd be like somebody else doing it. And this, of course, is a very simple metaphor, something called the mirror neuron system, this notion that there are certain neuronal circuits and populations in the brain that are active when we do something, but also respond when we see somebody else doing the same thing. So from the point of view of the generative model, this is easy to explain because exactly the same mechanisms and predictive coding schemes can predict both the proprioceptive dynamics that drive our own behavior, but also predict the consequences, the visual consequences, the extraceptive consequences of that behavior if somebody else does it, and we just need to attenuate or attend to one source of sensory stream or prediction errors and not the other. And indeed, when you simulate this, it's easy to show that exactly the same neuronal responses here. What we've done is just indicated when the neuronal activity of the central pattern generator exceeds half its maximum, and we've plotted those points of threshold crossings as a function of where the hand was in space. And what we get is something which is very reminiscent of things like place cells and grid cells in mammalian brains, in the sense that they fire when the arm is seen to be in a particular trajectory, and also with a direction selectivity. So this particular cell, this one here, or population, likes downstrokes but not the upstrokes. And exactly the same cells respond when the agent is looking at the same movements, but is not actually causing those movements itself. It takes a little bit longer for this these predictive coding or this Helmholtz decomposition of gradient flow to catch up, but eventually it does properly recognizes this kind of movement. So, is that good enough to understand neural dynamics and of agents like you and me? I would submit not. There's one final move which we have to think about in terms of what makes us agents. And I'm going to motivate that just by changing one simple thing in this Markov blanket. I'm going to remove the causal influence between the active states and the internal states. I'm going to increase this, if you like, the separation. And it's a kind of move that you would always have to countenance when thinking about deep generative models, where once you get deep into the brain, for example, the deeper parts of the generative model do no longer have direct access to the active states. But something quite remarkable happens. If I remove the connection from the active states to the internal states, from the red to the blue, then what we're left with is a situation in which the active states now become vicarious causes of the sensory states. But we've just said we can always interpret the internal states as perceiving, recognizing, inferring the causes of the sensory states, which means now there's an interpretation of my internal states as inferring my own actions. And that takes us into a very different world, because now we can talk about neuronal dynamics, for example, of certain kinds of things. So this is not true of everything, but those things that have this particularly deep structure in which there is a sequestering of the active states from the internal states. We now have this interesting situation where the internal states will look as if they are inferring the active states of the particle in question, which now you could call an agent. You can understand this in many different ways. Sometimes people like to go to planning as inference. So planning what to do is inferring what am I going to do next. And if I can infer correctly what I'm most likely to do, I can send the predictions down and make my reflexes make that come true. But crucially, my internal states now encode beliefs of a Bayesian subpersonal technical sort about my own actions. So we move from simple viruses or thermostats and other simple creatures that have the sort of actions, locality, and usually the active states are hidden beneath the sensory states. We just into this sort of action at a distance, literally, where we're distancing the active states and the internal states, such that now our variational posterior that is encoded by my internal states now covers both my action and the external states. So my action now becomes, if you like, an external state, even though I own it. And this takes us into a different kind of world, which is probably more apt for describing things like you and me. I'll just close with a number of interesting decompositions of these variational bounds that apply to what some people call merely reflexive active inference. This is predictive coding with reflexes, and this more authentic kind of agency that entails the ability to plan into the future. And as soon as you say that, you're talking about things whose generative models necessarily entail the consequences of their own actions in the future, because the consequences are not yet inferred. So we're talking about very special kinds of agents that have a future pointing, that have a counterfactual aspect. And in virtue of having a counterfactual aspect, they also effectively have intentions, things that they're choosing to work towards in the future. And this mathematically it's fairly straightforward to derive in terms of variational free energy describing the gradient flows for sense making. But when it comes to the paths into the future using a pathological formulation, you can express the probability of committing to this course of action or that course of action in terms of the free energy you'd expect if I went that way or went that way into the future. And that's referred to as expected free energy. So what I've done here is just put the variational free energy and expected free energy, express them in a number of different ways, which I think are really interesting and to my mind quite beautiful isomorphism. So here, let's just take the variational free energy. This is in machine learning, this will be known as a negative variational free energy would be called an elbow, an evidence lower bound. It's kind of objective function you find in the variational autoencoder. But as a statistician, you would interpret this as a mixture of accuracy and complexity, where the complexity is just the KL divergence between my posterior beliefs about the causes of my data and my prior beliefs. So it just scores the degree to which I've had to change my mind to provide an accurate account of my data in terms of my hypothesis, my beliefs about how those data were caused. And that will be an accurate account of the sensory data in terms of my expectations about the causes, the hidden states, eta here, but under these complexity constraints. But if I was doing machine learning, I would just swap these terms around and I would just rearrange them so that they were now decomposed into a KL divergence that can never be less than 0 between my variational density and the actual true posterior over the causes of my sensations given my sensory data, minus the log probability of those sensations, the marginal likelihood, the log evidence, hence the self-evidencing. And this is why it's called an elbow. So the free energy provides a bound approximation to the log evidence or the marginal likelihood. The interesting thing, though, is when we move into the future, conditioned upon a particular course of action, say a policy, the complexity becomes risk, the inaccuracy becomes ambiguity, the divergence becomes an intrinsic value, and the log evidence becomes an extrinsic value. So what do I mean by these things? Well, you probably already know. It's just a question of unpacking them with the right rhetoric. Let's just focus on this intrinsic value. So what is this term? Well, it's the expected bound. That when talking about the future, when the sensory input is now a random variable because it hasn't yet occurred, it turns into an information game. It's a relative entropy, it's still a KL divergence, but now it's an information game that I'm going to want to maximize. And this emerges, for example, in the visual search literature in the neurosciences in terms of something called Bayesian surprise, where my eye movements or saccades are attracted to that will resolve the greatest amount of uncertainty about the causes of my visual input. It's also just the mutual information between the cause and consequence, the hidden causes and the sensory consequences that would be evinced if I took this conditioned upon this particular action, coming right back to principles of minimum redundancy or maximum mutual information or maximum supports. So effectively, the intrinsic value plays a role of an epistemic affordance. It plays a role that underwrites information seeking, underwrites curiosity, the choosing those actions that resolve the greatest amount of uncertainty about the causes of my sensations. Let's take a certain kind of uncertainty off the table and see what's left. I'm going to remove the ambiguity. So what does that mean? Well, it means that effectively I can see the hidden states directly. So given the hidden states, I know exactly what the sensory states are and vice versa. So there is no conditional uncertainty or conditional entropy about the sensory states given the external states or their causes. So I put all the lights on. I can see everything that I need to see. There is no ambiguity in this particular world or this context. What am I left with? I'm left with another KL divergence between the external states conditioned upon action and my prior beliefs or preferences about the kind of external states, of course, the sensations that characterize me. So that's just KL control. So I'm going to minimize the risk, the expected complexity, if you like, simply by committing to those actions that minimize the difference or the divergence between what I anticipate will happen if I do that and what I prefer a priori to happen, given the kind of thing that I am. And I repeat, if you were an engineer, this would be path interval or KL control. If you're an economist, it would be something called risk sensitive or akin to risk sensitive control. So finally, let's take all uncertainty off the table. So there's no ambiguity, and furthermore, there's no resolvable uncertainty. There's no more epistemic affordance or allure. There's no exploratory drive anymore in this. I now find out everything I can find out about in this environment. I'm just left with the extrinsic value. What's that? Well, we just said it's just the expected value. It's just the log probability and this log evidence or utility if you're an economist. So it's just expected utility. So in the limiting case of no uncertainty, I've now got back to expected utility theory and the underpinnings of reinforcement learning. So just to close by illustrating not the utilitarian aspect, but the information seeking, not the goal seeking, but the information seeking aspect of this Bayesian mechanics that just inherits from the existence of a Markov blanket. I'm showing a simulation of eye movements, active vision or active sampling, where we can now interpret the expected free energy as scoring the salience of different kinds of movements. And if I just plot out my all the ways in which I could move my eyes, so I can look over here, 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 through all the points that I could look at, I've created what's called a salience map. And we actually know where in the brain to find these salience maps, and we can simulate this. So here, for example, if I was only allowed to see a small portion of the image, how much uncertainty would I resolve if I looked here in relation to hypotheses about what was the cause, what was the sculpture causing, in this instance, my sensory input. And we can compute that in terms of this KL divergence, or its epistemic affordance or intrinsic value. Also, I should add in robotics, it's sometimes referred to as intrinsic motivation, what motivates behavior intrinsically in the absence of any reward or prior preferences. And I can just move this little circle around and score the salience of the expected free energy and get a salience map. And indeed, it does attract where humans look here, reported by the classic work of Yarbus. So we can simulate this. And this is the final slide now. And what this is showing is a very simple simulation where the agent lived in a very simple world. The world could be in the state that there's an upright face causing visual sensations, a sideways face, or an upside down face. But the agent doesn't know that. She has to carefully choose where to look because she can only palpate or look at a certain small part of the visual scene, very much like we can just sample our foveal samples very sparsely and in a saltatory fashion sequentially to build up a picture for this evidence accumulation process. So how is she going to choose where to look? Well, she's going to choose those positions that have the greatest expected free energy or epistemic affordance. And indeed, these are the locations that are chosen by the synthetic agent, picking out most informative parts of the visual image that disambiguate whether the world is upside down or not. And after a few saccadic eye movements, posterior uncertainty or Bayesian credible intervals about the correct orientation of the face causing the sensory input is inferred after a couple of moves. There's a nice example of very simple illustration of something which we are implicitly, or most of us as scientists and doctors, conform to, which is the principles of optimum Bayesian experimental design, basically eliciting the right responses from your patients or the right kind of data from your fMRI or EEG or MEG or PM setup, the right sort of psychophysical responses from psychology, just eliciting the right kind of data that will be maximally informative in the sense of resolving the greatest amount of uncertainty over the space of hypotheses or models that you're bringing to the table to try and understand what's going on. And with that, I think we can now close by referring back to Helmholtz, who articulated that much more succinctly than I have. Each movement we make by which we alter the appearance of objects should be thought of as an experiment designed to test whether we have understood correctly the invariant relations of the phenomena before us, that is, their existence in definite spatial relations. With that, it just remains for me to thank all those people whose ideas I've been talking about, some of which are listed here. Of course, to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Karl, for the tour de force and a great start to the lecture series. Now, we'll take questions from the audience. Just the one thing we need to know how to do this is raise your hand, and then when you've got the nod, and press the button on the mic, and then your mic will be turned on. Okay? So questions? Okay, at the back.
Hello, Dr. Friston. Thank you for the great talk. So the biological substrate for predictive coding is still being searched for, and specifically the definitive evidence for an error signal is still unclear. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is, what is the empirical evidence for a predictive coding scheme being implemented in the brain? It's a great question because it allows you to make a number of distinctions. So predictive coding is just one of a number of particular schemes that could be, if you like, put in play to do this, the generic gradient flows that we're talking about, that inherit from the free energy principle. So the free energy principle is a principle, it's a method. How you apply that method then is a question that offers an opportunity to test various theories about how it's applied. So you could say, I have a theory that the actual implementation of the brain conforms to a predictive coding architecture. And that would entail certain commitments. So for example, you'd be immediately committing to some continuous state-space generative models, the explicit representation of, or encoding of prediction errors, explicit representation of free energy gradients as position-weighted prediction errors, and specifically that they were encoded, say, in the firing of a particular population, so the most popular population is superficial family cell. And then you can go and search for evidence for that. So that has been a meme, that there has been no direct evidence at single cell level for some time. In fact, I think this year that there has now been definitive evidence using optogenetics and electrophysiology. I know that because I had to review the paper, but I don't know if it's come out yet. I'm sure it has since several months ago. So now there are a number of papers now that I've read and reviewed in the past year showing definitive evidence for error coding at the single cell level, usually in the visual cortex, usually in small animal. Having said that, the circumstantial evidence for predictive coding in the early visual system is absolutely overwhelming. In the sense that predictive coding was not identified as, oh, that's a good idea, perhaps we should go and see if the brain looks like that. It was much more, we know an enormous amount about the visual hierarchy, we know an enormous amount about the importance of the current connections and the asymmetry in terms of ascending and descending physiology and synaptic effects. All of these point to predictive coding. So there's an enormous amount of empirical evidence that has been accrued before people brought predictive coding as a potential sort of mathematical image to it. Just that simple things like ranging from the very existence of cortical hierarchies and hierarchical organization as celebrated by the seminal work of people like Kellerman and Van Essen, through to just obvious implications of predictive coding, such as omission responses. So in physiology, one of the favorite paradigms people have is called a mismatch negativity paradigm, where you sort of present something that was unpredicted and it elicits a bigger response that can be interpreted in terms of prediction error. But the omission-related mismatch negativity is even more interesting, because that means you're eliciting a surprise response, a prediction error in response with nothing. So the subject expects something to happen, but nothing happens. So there is no sensory input, and yet you elicit this this mismatch negativity, mismatch. So to me, that's, along with, say, dreaming, that's very definitive evidence that predictive coding is at least along the right lines. Perhaps the most telling empirical evidence, though, which we're interested in the point of view of brain modes, is that these ascending influences under predictive coding scheme have a driving-like linear effect, whereas by construction, because you've got a nonlinear generative model, the descending or the reverse connections are nonlinear. So that means by definition, or by construction, the spectral decomposition of the dynamics has to have some cross-frequency coupling, so like a period doubling. Like imagine squaring a sine wave and you double the period, which means that you're now looking for spectral asymmetries in visual cortices during either induced or evoked response, during induced responses, which you actually see. And this was predicted 3 to 4 years before it was found experimentally. So that's my favorite. There are other examples in anatomy, but if you look closely, there is overwhelming. But I don't think predictive coding is a particularly good metaphor for most of the brain. So there are other kinds of generative models which are more apt for describing language and discrete decision making. Or if I'm deciding what word to say next, that's a very discrete thing. Am I going to go to the living room or the kitchen? Am I going to go to, am I going to stay in tonight or go to the movies? These are discrete things. So you're now looking at the application of these energy minimizing mechanics to discrete state space models. And you're in a very different world there, in the world of brief propagation, variational message passing, and the like, which still has a biological plausibility, but it's another kind of theory. And I think that's probably more apt to say fronto-hippocampal interactions. And indeed, you could argue that the very existence of receptive fields tells you immediately that our brains carve nature at its joints into discrete objects. So that, for example, if I take some cells in visual sensitive area V5, then they respond to and only to a particular movement at a particular velocity, which can be sort of interpreted as that I like this discrete event. There's something, an edge moving at 8 degrees per second in this quadrant of the visual field, which of course takes you to a very different mindset in terms of what you're actually representing. Are you tiling the world and carving nature to its joints in this discrete way? Or are you still in the world of predictive coding and basic filtering? I don't know. At some point, I think there must be a shift from the continuous to the discrete.
My question is regarding continuity of perception. So if you have error signals and predictive coding, it seems like continuity is a problem. So because when we perceive the world, it's sort of continuous in time, not in chunks of things. Is there sort of, do we always perceive sort of the past to achieve continuity, or how do you sort of account for continuity of perception?
That's a great question. I think you could account for it either as an engineer, or you could account for it from through the account of the basic mechanics. So I think the engineer would say to you, well, look, as with all of physics, you're working in generalized coordinates of motion, or with generalized coordinates, whether it's sort of position, momentum, or whether it's doing Kalman filtering implicitly, there's always a velocity. So as soon as you realize you're working in generalized coordinates, particularly generalized coordinates of motion, you're talking about little trajectories and paths. So all of this mechanics, and certainly all the simulations I showed today, all of them, including the active vision ones, we're working generalized quants of motion. So we're working not with states of being, but with little trajectories that have baked into them this contiguity. So that even when you've got this sort of merely reflexive active inference in play, it's still contiguous. It's still, you know, a continuous path, a continuous trajectory. Another interesting perspective on that is that, you know, that your beliefs are now not about the moment; they're about little trajectories, so that you're freed from the specious present, alien remembered present. So you're talking now about representing the world in terms of dynamics that has baked into it and must have, by the principles of least action, that is another way of framing what I've been talking about, that must have exactly the continuity you're talking about. Things get even more interesting when you talk about deep temporal models. So one aspect of these deeper models, as you get deeper and deeper and deeper into your generative model, things tend to slow down, very much in the spirit of the renormalization group and adiabatic approximation, so that higher levels will be predicting the parameters of the equations of motion of lower levels. So there's fast stuff happening low down, and then slower stuff level above, and even slower stuff. So there's a progressive slowing. We saw examples of that today. In fact, you know, the sort of the frontal part of the brain do things more slowly there. Time concentration much longer, should probably show more critical slowing than the sensory use. And all of this is just a reflection of the fact that it's likely that in our world we have this scale invariance, we have this sort of, you know, a renormalization group like separation of temporal scales, but at each scale there is continuity.
Hi, my question is about noise inside the Markov blanket. So in some of the graphics you display, there is noise in the external states, but of course the inference engine inside is also noisy. Where does that show up and how does it behave?
Again, that's a brilliant question. So from the point of view of a simple reading of the free energy principle would respond to that, saying, well, the simplest application would be to large things that are sufficiently large that the random fluctuations average away on the inside. And indeed, have evolved to have sufficiently large sensory epithelia that the random fluctuations at the scale, at an appropriate scale, are basically zero. And that gives you an interesting picture of a particle that is effectively conservative, embedded in a dissipative world. So the actual dynamics, the autonomous dynamics of the particle, where I'm reading autonomous is basically internal and the active parts, but also including the sensory parts, they now pursue exactly paths of least action because there are no random fluctuations about the paths of least action, which means that you can now describe the sentient behavior of large things like you and me, and possibly mice, but probably not viruses. They're probably a bit too small. But certainly things that are big enough to ignore the random fluctuations as conforming exactly to a variation principle of least action, where the free energy is a path integral of the action is the path integral of the free energy we've been talking about. If you go smaller and smaller and smaller, and you want to apply this to, say, you know, viruses, then I think you have to you qualify everything in terms of the expected, in terms of the average trajectories. And I find that really interesting because, you know, all the lawful behavior that we normally associate with, you know, our understanding of self-organization all rests upon averages. So in neuroscience, for example, you see this everywhere, whether it's, you know, ERPs and event-rated averaging, whether it's linear convolution models with repeated trials in fMRI, whether it's population averages in clinical trials. Every time you try and make an inference, this caused that, then you are basing that inference upon averaging. Same with the double slit experiment in physics. You know, you don't get the phenomenology, you know, you don't get the explanations until you look at how the thing behaves on average. And of course, this speaks, of course, to this recurrence that you get with these pullback attractors. So that basically means things only exist on average. And that came to my mind several times during today's presentations when people focusing on noise. So, you know, there are two responses to the noise. You can either say that the level of single neurons, for example, they're very, very noisy, but predictive coding does not work at the level of single neurons. It works upon population averages where there is no noise. So the internal dynamics at the appropriate scale that you can pick now is deterministic and conforms to the path of the principle of least action. Or you can say that the variability within a population that is due to the noise itself plays a functional role in encoding the precision of the neg entropy of what's going on. And if you take the Fokker-Planck, the mean field approximation in the context of the Fokker-Planck formulation density dynamics, then some really interesting connections between the amplitude of random fluctuations and at the population level, the sensitivity, usually in terms of sort of error functions or sort of sigmoid activity response profiles. So you can either one way that people sometimes address this is you can either think that the brain is doing exact inference approximately through noisy ensembles, or it's doing approximate inference exactly through a coarse graining, taking the population averages. Is that all right?
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was wonderful. Along similar lines to the previous questions, I had more of a theoretical one. You described the boundaries of the Markov blanket, but what about the individual nodes? Are the individual nodes as small as atoms, or is there a size constraint? Is it in relation to the size of the entire system?
Again, wonderful question. So the nodes are just semi-states. So the question is, what scale would you draw your Markov blanket, and how many of them are there? So probably an uncountably large, countably infinite number. And they exist at all scales. So what normally happens at this stage, somebody puts a hand up and says, "Oh, I can't have a Markov blanket because I die." How does a candle flame have a Markov blanket? There's something that has transient dynamics have a Markov blanket for a limited amount of time. Usually, underneath the question is, are we talking about systems that have that are ergodic, if you like, Markov blanket for a limited amount of time? The resolution or the answer to that question is obviously no. What we're talking about are dynamics that have a steady state solution. They never actually attain it because the Markov blanket dissolves or go away. We metamorphosize, we die, we have children, or indeed, I cut my toenails and change my Markov blanket. So the Markov blanket only exists at a particular scale for a particular amount of time, and there can be multiple Markov blankets. So I can draw a Markov blanket around my the dendrite we were talking about before that had voltage and conductances. I could draw it around my hippocampus. I could draw it around my brain. I could draw it around my body. I could draw it around my family. I could draw it around my cultural econation, my country, my biosphere, and so on, any level. Same rules will apply at each level, but I can choose which Markov blanket. Of course, even within a system, there are multiple ways of drawing the Markov blanket, and indeed, in computer science, for example, in terms of working out the most efficient message passing, you use Markov blankets. You just need the message passing from your Markov blanket to do inference, for example. So even within a generative model, or within the internal states, you still have multiple. So, but the key point is that this, you have this, again, this renormalization group. You can't have a Markov blanket. I can't have a Markov blanket around my hippocampus unless my brain is viable for longer than my hippocampus survives. And my brain can't be viable unless my species is viable, as long as my I survive, and so on ad infinitum. So what that tells you is that there are Markov blankets and Markov blankets at multiple scales. With the separation temporal scales, things get slower and slower and slower as you get higher and higher and higher. So you're at liberty to choose. And I mean that literally as a theoretician, a philosopher, and a scientist or a doctor, you choose the level that you want to apply this. But the application, the reason I mentioned the renormalization group is that because that Helmholtz decomposition has to apply to anything where a thing can be disambiguated from everything else, has to be true at every level, then you know you've got the conservation of the Lagrangian or the dynamics in its functional form at every level. So now the interesting thing is, do you worry about the top down and bottom causation between one level and the next? Do I worry about the political free energy minimizing processes or evolutionary free energy minimizing processes such as Bayesian model selection, natural selection? Do I worry about how that contextualizes me, the phenotype, in terms of the scale of learning as another free energy minimizing process? So is that the kind of question and answer you were seeking?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, we've got time for a few more questions. We're a little bit over, but I think the questions are good. So up there.
Thank you, Professor Friston, for your wonderful talk. So my question was, I was curious about the name for today's lecture, that it's a direct reference to Descartes' cogito ergo sum. So I was just wondering, is it because the predictive brain model leans more toward physicalism? Was that the reason behind the name, or was there another reason? Thank you.
That's a very clever question. I can't remember now. It was just the original, but we should talk about physicalism. That's interesting. No, the original one was just, I was just teasing philosopher friends. And the idea was that I am is a statement that I am individuated from everything else. So just self-organization requires the existence of a Markov blanket. So everything inherits from the Markov blanket, including thinking. So thinking on this view is just a description. You don't have to invoke the Bayesian mechanics. It's just you are licensed to describe the behavior of anything you're observing that has a Markov blanket. And of course, you can only observe Markov blanket. You can't observe the internal states. Otherwise, you would breach the Markov blanket and change the kind of thing that you're observing. So something quintessentially Heinsbergian about being something. But if I want to understand the behavior of this thing, be it a patient or a small animal or one of my psychophysics subjects, then I can always describe it as self-evidencing and engaging in some kind of Bayesian mechanics. I'm not saying it doing that. I'd say I can always describe it as so doing. And therefore, I can always describe something as thinking in some elementary sense. Therefore, if it exists, if I am, then I can be described as thinking. So hence, I am, therefore I think. So it was turning the sort of Cartesian calls out on its head, and take a much more deflationary physicist's perspective on self-organization. But the physicalism aspect, I think, is interesting because it does really commit you to there being a world out there. So this takes you beyond transcendental idealism. I'm told I'm a transcendental idealist, but no one would tell me what that means. But I think it means that, like Kant, whatever Kant said, I don't know what he said, but anyway, it's Kantian. But once you move into Helmholtz, and once you put action in the game, into the mix, once you move from, say, visual neuroscience into active vision, for example, then there has to be a world out there that you can act upon. There has to be an external metaphysics that you act upon. So I think there was a bright line between Kant and Helmholtz, a subtle one, which does actually, I think, commit you to a sort of a physical realism, simply by completing that action perception cycle. Is that what you wanted to hear?
Thank you.
Okay, one last question.
Perfect. Thank you. If you'll permit me, because we're here at Sick Kids, a question from the perspective of children. I have been thinking a lot about applying the elegance of physics principles and laws to our human experience, and kind of the intergenerational effects and the capacity of our children to move about in the world and function. I was wondering if you could speak to that, and I think you've alluded to that in a few of your answers about variability in populations, but I just would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, well, we don't have the time because there are so many ways that one could take that question through the basic problems of. We've been talking very much about sort of inference, but of course inference at a slower time scale, referring to this adiabatic or slow, separation of temporal timescales, is learning. So we also are treating learning one's generative model as a free energy minimizing process, and indeed much of machine learning could be cast in terms of this sort of approximations to it. But from the point of view of neurodevelopment, what we're talking about is how on earth does a newborn learn its generative model of its lived world, which of course is 99% mother in the first instance. But it's got to learn basically what it can cause and what it can't cause. And so there's some lovely work on ranging from treatment of different attachment styles and attachment theory, and how you come to separate me from mum, and just realizing that there is such a thing as a mum, and mum has her own intentions, a big mood that may license theory in mind, right through to even more elemental work on things like baby mobile paradigms. Why is it that babies like to rattle stuff or move their mobiles? Because the old idea was that it's just like self-stimulation, sort of self-stimulating to their autism. But it looks